Hey everybody, it's Tom, and coming to you this week to discuss Sigmund Freud's His Civilization and Its Discontents from the back corner of the Highland Coffee House here in Cincinnati, Ohio. Civilization and Its Discontents. An odd little work, worth reading. Go ahead and put that up there so you can see it. This is sort of like the standard edition or the most commonly read English translation. It's a nice little brief biography to preface it by Peter Gay and a useful editor's introduction. Came out in 1929. I chose it 1929, 1930, right on the cusp of those 2 years. And I chose it because in many ways I felt it would be emblematic of the broader significance of Sigmund Freud's contributions, Sigmund Freud's obviously immense influence. Serendipitously, it provides a kind of contrast with what we were discussing last week. Very different work, a work which one would not naturally associate with Civilization and Its Discontent. Shambhala, or The Sacred Path of the Warrior by Chogyam Trungpa, in which he is asserting that there's just simply a fundamental positive or good aspect to reality, and on the basis of connecting with that, we can achieve something like an authentic freedom. In making this assertion, Trungpa is, and I am on the same page as Trungpa here, coming into a direct confrontation with what is being set forth by Freud, who takes a very jaundiced view of the potentials for human happiness. That is in a real way because of how he is conceiving human happiness, namely as a relationship with pleasure. It's a hedonic or hedonistic account and is intimately related with his own theories of personality structure, development, and so forth, where our emergence as human beings, as individuals, the formation of our identities, all these processes arise out of an effort to find the optimal solution to the hedonic calculus, to the accentuation of pleasure, the diminution of pain. He's departing from sort of more obvious utilitarian framings in as far as the access to these pleasures is mediated through our relationships, initially with our parent figures and then with other human beings. And famously, of great significance in this connection is the sexual energy as it informs the unfolding of these processes, which are attributed to the ego. And well, it's tricky. And to elaborate is to go a little bit outside of the basis of the text. So in a moment I may come back to that, but to stay on point with the text, what is he doing here? Well, it doesn't actually begin with the direct confrontation of the issue of civilization and the discontents which attend to civilization. Rather, he's coming out of his previous work, The Future of an Illusion, which outlines a particular conception of religion as a mass delusion, an architecture which serves to constrain the exercise of people's natural impulses and drives to make them more social. So the function of religion is fundamentally an oppressive one and a constraining one under that dispensation. And a friend of his, while on one hand stating a broad sympathy for the analysis, noted that another origin for the religious motif can be found in a kind of feeling or an intimation or an intuition of one's connection with the universe at large, a feeling of oneness, of communion, of even a kind of ecstatic absorption. Freud remarks that despite not having personally an affinity with such states or experiences, on his own part, says, well, yes, these things do occur, but what do they mean? And puts forth that these kinds of experiences are not, in fact, primary or indicative of something which is spontaneous and which is presenting itself to the subject as the significance of this moment, but rather are echoes of an infantile sense of connection with the world that predates the development of the child's identity. Sense of communion, for example, with its mother, particularly vis-a-vis breastfeeding, etc., etc. And so the mind harbinges vestiges of that time, and the fundamental warm, gooey, lovely, more or less unmitigated pleasure of that time, and wants to fix upon them as informing the significance of reality more broadly. It responds to the impositions of reality, such as its eventual separation from its mother, the authority of the father, etc., etc., by modifying its relationship with access to that pleasure. This is what becomes known as the reality principle, which then sort of brackets our immediate access to pleasure so that over a longer term we can more efficiently access pleasure. Ugh. So, anyway, the significance of this move on Freud's part is that he then evades the possibility that within religious traditions we have a vocabulary that discusses a kind of relationship with reality that is certainly more uplifting than the one which he is proffering, and a relationship with reality which offers that the universe is not a hostile place. For Hobbes, that's a for Hobbes, but for Freud, that's a non-starter. It's a little Freudian slip, but a not altogether uninformed one, because Freud is drawing heavily upon a kind of Hobbesian anthropology in the course of his remarks. So, in short, the book essentially opens with a critique of religion and a critique of a possible way out of a wholesale rejection of religion. This is followed upon by the engagement of the question of civilization as discontent proper, because we exist and other peoples have existed at high levels of civilization, and despite such obvious benefits as attend to that development, such as infrastructure, hygiene, certain guidances in terms of how we relate with each other, there's a broad-based malaise or discontent or even a deficit of happiness, which has led in some quarters to a critique of civilization itself as a project that perhaps we should simply reject. Well, so what's going on here, friends? What's going on? Well, what's going on is we have to ask, what is the basis, to sort of paraphrase, what is the basis of this discontent? Does it represent a defect in civilization that can be repaired, or is it something which inheres in civilization and which thus will determine whether or not it's something worth pursuing or not? The answer which he offers is that this discontent, this malaise, this lack of access to unbridled happiness is in fact intrinsic to the structure of civilization. And we've kind of adumbrated why he feels like that in some remarks earlier, a few minutes ago. He feels like that because civilization provides mantle or a matrix or a lattice work that hems in the degree to which we can give rein toward our inner drives, our impulses. And here, what are those impulses? Well, there's really sort of three players on the table here, all right? The first two, which are present almost from the outset of Freud's career, are the egoic impulses and the libidinous impulses. The ego is that part of ourselves which is driving to formulate an identity which allows access to pleasure and to a kind of self-assertion. On the other hand, there are the libidinous, or the impulses of the libido, which are almost the impulses of the species that drive us to procreate and to expand the lot of human beings in general as a species. Is very biotic, but there's obviously a conflict of interest between these two terms, between the egoic drives and the libidinous drives. Clearly, libidinous drives are crucial to the development of civilization because they provide the energy which motivates people to create the frameworks for cities and all the rest of it that are the hallmark of civilization. But couldn't do the work without the ego, which is that sort of part of ourselves that can be exploited with the interplays of carrots and sticks. And you need them both. And ideally, a kind of balance should be attainable, which would allow moderate satisfaction of both of these two sets of drives, despite the tensions which exist between them. And in light of that, you say, well, in light of that, well, the whole project of civilization should run pretty smoothly, maybe even along a direction of linear, even more than linear advancement. But the testimony of history says otherwise. And you can look at things like war and hunger and certain technologies, and you're like, oh my Lord, what a mess. The slaughter bench of history, as Hegel said. And it doesn't seem reasonable to attribute the abated or retarded pace at which civilization proceeds after a fashion so tumultuous. It doesn't seem possible to attribute that turmoil, that tumult, and that restrained development merely to the tensions which arise between the ego and the libido. And hence we are led, or hence Freud is led to posit yet another impulse, an impulse toward destructiveness, toward death, toward sadism. Sadism is really the clue which ultimately leads him to posit this as something which is innate in human being, and which at the end of the day is the reason why we have things like war and hunger and terrible technologies like nuclear weapons and all the rest of it. There's something rotten in the state of the human being as is manifested by this drive, the drive to death, or thanatos, as opposed to eros. I think it's thanatos. In any event, so there's this is the bottom line for Freud, that there's something just bad inside of us. It may not be the whole picture, but it's there, and our development as individual, I'm sorry, I work at looking at the camera, not at the screen, apologies for that. This conflict exists within us as individuals, and for him leads to the solution, a solution vis-a-vis the development of the superego. Superego sort of appropriates internally the imperatives which we initially encounter as extrinsic vis-a-vis our relationship with our parents and all the rest of us, that intimate moral constraint. But they have more power. The superego is more powerful than extrinsic restrained because it's de facto omniscient with respect to our own thoughts, and hence intentionality, as opposed to the actual commission of a deed, is sufficient to condemn us. And this places us from the beginning in a state of almost unremediable guilt. All that, of course, I've just described internally, but it is mapped on a broader scale in terms of what happens with civilizations at large. And so, to draw us back, given the sketch to the beginning, the question, or the beginning of the main question, as to whether civilization is worthwhile and what is the relationship of this malaise or discontent. Well, this malaise or discontent is more or less just an expression of the guilt which arises as a consequence of the authority of the superego over our ego and over our lower impulses, our id. And this is necessary in order to arrive at a state where we can have a sort of mediated access to pleasure, and also civilization in a broader sense, and human beings can prosper more effectively and all the rest of it. In short, for Freud, the discontent, the malaise, and all the rest of it is intrinsic to civilization as a mechanism which permits it. It's actually the condition of the possibility of civilization. And so what does that say about civilization? Is it something that we should sort of just give up? And Freud's answer would probably be, well, no. And the reason being that cost-benefit analysis-wise, even though we don't get that total unmitigated access of pleasure which may theoretically be available in, let us say, a state of nature, he doesn't use that phrase, but he points directly in that corner. We can sustain ourselves over a broader interval and in a more reasonable and secured fashion if we just go ahead and allow guilt to operate. Well, and so there you have it. I mean, that's a nutshell. And I guess I should add that in the course of these remarks, something that was particularly shocking to me was that he appends to this analysis, which I have hopefully not too imperfectly recapitulated here, a critique of the Golden Rule as essentially an action of the superego as it manifests at a societal level, and a critique of the Golden Rule as simply being unreasonable from the outset. So, I'm going to proffer a certain respect for Freud because there's an authenticity which informs this analysis, and he strove, as far as I understand, to live his life in a manner with an integrity which reflected a commitment to these presuppositions in a relatively decent fashion. So that, tip of my hat, having been offered, I think that he is ultimately way off base. I mean, from the beginning, from the outset, from his presuppositions about the nature of happiness, about human beings, about reality itself. There may be reasons, personal or otherwise, which inspired him to make these commitments, but as we're coming up on 20 minutes, I'm just going to summarize the basis of my disagreement. He's off base about human beings because I don't feel that he appreciates the degree to which, whereas obviously we can do bad things, that we do bad things is a consequence of unfortunate circumstances that distort the expression of our natural inclination. And the kind of sort of very basic and suggestive fact I might offer is that the bad news gets all the press. Fact of the matter is that the world more or less works. And the reason it more or less works is because most people do the right thing most of the time. Almost all of us are really trying to do the right thing, and not just because we're living out of an obedience to some guilt arriving from the operation of our super egos, but because we actually have a sense of empathy and connection and relationship with other people. Not just the people in our family, but our friends and beyond our friends, to the people in our neighborhood, and ultimately, potentially, to the world at large. Unfortunately, obviously, there are forces that operate for various reasons to mitigate the expression of this natural inclination to a far-reaching and embracing compassion, but is there notwithstanding. If it wasn't there notwithstanding, basically, we would never have arrived at where we are today. I always say it's a point of axiomatic discord. It's the sort of thing you can go back and forth ad infinitum. But that's number one, where I think Freud is missing the boat. And then he's also missing the boat, which number one and number two, because as I recall, human beings, our relationship with each other, and then nature at large. Whatever our relationship with each other may be, you have to ask whether the universe itself is worthwhile or whether it's a hostile place. And again, this is a point of axiomatic disagreement. I'm going to say yes, absolutely. Have you ever looked at a sunset? Have you visited the Grand Canyon, proverbially speaking? And even within this work, Freud alludes to moments of personal endearment, which he must have experienced in his own life, for example, with his children, with his friends, with other people. Okay, I don't think he's appreciating the significance of these small acts as pointing toward a greater world, which actually was the point of departure for Chogyam Trungpa in his work last week, where he's like, look, you got to recognize that these seemingly little things actually have cosmic import. The world is better for being rather than not. Freud is responding to serious issues, to the fact that there is a cultural malaise, that there are problems with our civilization. But I think he misses the mark when he identifies these infelicities as the precondition for a civilized being, and also for the worth of our life and the worth of the world. So with all due respect to the good doctor, I feel that he's really fallen off of what might otherwise have been a very promising analysis. So there we have it for this week. Sigmund Freud, Civilization and Its Discontents. Feel free to subscribe. Feel free to leave any remarks you have in below, and I will essay to get to them. I'm having some trouble with my computer not telling me when to get comments, so if I don't get to it right away, apologies for that. I will. I'll leave it at that for now. What are we going to do next week? I'm not certain. I'm leaning towards... Well, I got a few irons in the fire, but I think we might head up some... I just don't know. There's different candidates. I might do some Kierkegaard. You know what? I'm going to do Rousseau. We're going to do some Rousseau. We're going to take a slight detour and go visit Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He's sur le contrôle social, on his social contract or something like that. That's what we'll do next week. Anyway, this has been Tom Lynn talking to you about Sigmund Freud, and hopefully you found those sentiments stimulating, and hopefully I'll see you guys soon. All right, ciao.